Omaha, Nebraska, in the 1960s wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was a city of straight-laced neighborhoods, modest homes, and unassuming families who believed in hard work and privacy. On a tree-lined street not far from Dundee Elementary, there stood a 5-bedroom house that looked like any other, a brick structure with an old porch swing and a driveway that saw more bicycles than luxury cars. This was the Buffett home. Inside lived Peter Buffett, the youngest of 3 siblings, and just another kid trying to find his way through math homework, piano practice, and the occasional scraped knee from riding too fast down the hill. The house was filled with warmth, laughter, and a set of quiet, old-school values. Save what you earn, share what you can, and never brag about what you have. There were no butlers, no maids, and certainly no sports cars in the garage. Just a used sedan that coughed to life every morning and the steady hum of everyday life. If you asked young Peter what his father did for a living, the answer wouldn't have made much sense, even to him. Security analysis, his sister had written once on a school form. To Peter, that sounded like some kind of neighborhood job. Maybe their dad checked alarm systems, monitored banks. Whatever it was, it didn't seem that exciting. After all, Mr. Buffett left every morning wearing the same nondescript suit and came home in time for dinner, never missing a little league game or family night. The household never indulged in flashy vacations or designer anything. While some kids at school wore the latest sneakers or boasted about trips to Disneyland, the Buffett kids carried packed lunches, went to public school, and learned to appreciate the little things. Their childhood was made of hand-me-down bikes, weekend chores, and a father who valued library cards over credit cards. And yet, behind that calm facade, a storm of numbers, investments, and financial wizardry quietly brewed in the head of the man they called Dad. A man who would one day be called the Oracle of Omaha. But for Peter, none of that mattered. Not yet. All he knew was the music calling to him from the old upright piano in the living room and the quiet encouragement of a father who never pushed, only listened. The real story hadn't begun for him yet. The curtain had barely lifted. The Buffett household had its rhythm, structured, simple, and strangely quiet when it came to money. The only signs that hinted at anything out of the ordinary were subtle. An old paper on the kitchen table about some company merger, a mysterious ticker playing on a tiny television in Warren's study, or the occasional visitor from New York or Los Angeles who spoke in quick, clipped tones and carried briefcases that never opened in front of the children. But none of this struck Peter as strange. If anything, he was too busy discovering something else entirely: music. While other kids chased baseball dreams or built model rockets, Peter was pulled toward sound. He could sit at the upright piano in the living room for hours, losing himself in melodies he didn't yet know how to write down. There was something magnetic in the way notes worked together, a language deeper than words, and Peter wanted to speak it fluently. He began composing as a teenager, experimenting with tape recorders and cheap synthesizers. His father noticed, of course, but instead of steering him toward the family name or the financial world that whispered behind closed doors, Warren simply nodded and said the words Peter would hear again and again over the years. Do what you love. Peter took that advice seriously. By the time he left home, he wasn't following in the footsteps of a business magnate. He was chasing gigs, auditioning for obscure music projects, and taking freelance work composing soundtracks for low-budget videos and commercials. To many, it looked like he was struggling to find his place. But to Peter, it felt like he was building something real, something his. Still, there were moments of confusion. Friends would occasionally mention his father with reverence. Professors would give a second look at his last name. And once, after submitting a music demo, a producer asked, "Any relation to the Buffett?" Peter shrugged it off. He wasn't sure what the Buffett even meant. Back in Omaha, his father's life continued in that same understated hum. No interviews plastered on the walls, no luxury vacations, no mention of portfolios or profits at family dinners. Warren still drove the same old car, still lived in the same modest house, still showed up like a regular dad. Peter assumed they were simply frugal, smart with money, maybe. Certainly not poor, but nowhere near wealthy. Not in the way that word usually carried itself, with loud toys, gated driveways, and headlines. And so, Peter kept composing, kept renting cheap studios, kept living paycheck to paycheck. All the while, completely unaware that the man who quietly encouraged him was quietly building one of the greatest fortunes in modern history. The spotlight hadn't turned yet, but it was getting closer. By the time Peter Buffett turned 25, he had already lived what most would call a full young life. He had moved away from Omaha, released some of his early music, worked on small film and commercial scores, and was trying, day by day, to shape his own world in the unpredictable music industry. He was living modestly, hustling from one creative gig to the next, piecing together a career on his own terms. But then, slowly, subtly, the world began to show him something he hadn't seen before. It started with strangers, music industry professionals, journalists, or event organizers who seemed unusually curious when they saw his last name. Some were bold enough to ask directly, "Are you related to the Warren Buffett?" Peter, who had heard his father's name increasingly pop up in financial news and magazine covers, would reply modestly, "Yeah, he's my dad." But the reaction that followed always felt out of proportion. The reverence, the wide eyes, the jokes about stock tips, and sometimes something else entirely. A tone that hinted at disbelief. How could this guy be living so simply if his father was that rich? It was confusing at first, but the questions kept coming. The mentions grew louder. A casual conversation about investments at a friend's house turned into a full-blown lesson in Berkshire Hathaway stock. Peter listened, half curious, half bewildered, as someone explained that Warren Buffett wasn't just good with money. He was changing the financial world. It was then that Peter began connecting the dots. Dots that had been hiding in plain sight. The quiet conversations in the study. The well-dressed visitors with briefcases. The way people paused when they heard his last name. The articles, the interviews, the praise that seemed to be multiplying overnight. One evening, Peter sat alone in his small apartment, holding an old article he had dug up out of curiosity. It was about Berkshire Hathaway. His father's name was mentioned again and again. Warren Buffett, one of the most successful investors in history. The man behind the empire. The oracle who built billions from a philosophy of patience and precision. Peter was stunned. Billions? He had known, of course, that his father was good with money. But he had no idea Warren Buffett had built one of the most powerful financial legacies of the modern world. And certainly no idea that the world already regarded him as an icon. He stared at the article, at the numbers, at the face in the small black and white photo, smiling in that modest, familiar way. The man he had called Dad his entire life wasn't just successful. He was one of the richest men alive. Peter leaned back and exhaled, not sure whether to laugh or cry. Because in that moment, at 25 years old, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his childhood, his family, and his father's quiet life in Omaha was only part of the story. By the time Peter Buffett processed the truth, that his father wasn't just wealthy, but extraordinarily wealthy, he was already deep into the life he had chosen. He was living in Milwaukee, renting a small apartment, and still chasing melodies more than money. He had grown comfortable with the idea that creativity didn't always pay well, and that meaning was worth more than comfort. But now, with the revelation of his father's immense fortune, Peter faced a new kind of question, one that silently asked, "What now?" Would his life change? Should it? That answer came, quietly, in the form of a gift. Not a lecture, not a bank transfer, but a moment. One afternoon, Warren sat down with Peter and offered him something from the family's past, shares of Berkshire Hathaway stock, a gift passed down from Peter's grandfather. The total value? Around $90,000 at the time. To most people, it would have been a launch pad to luxury. To Peter, it was something far more complex. There were no strings attached, no demands, no suggestion that he pivot his life or leave music behind. But there was a message between the lines, a subtle, unmistakable whisper of his father's philosophy. This is enough to do anything, but not enough to do nothing. Peter knew immediately what it meant. This wasn't an inheritance designed to free him from work. It was fuel, a boost, a gentle push forward on the road he had already chosen. His father wasn't inviting him into the world of finance. He was reinforcing the value of independence, of responsibility, and of earned success. And that clarity changed everything. Peter didn't go out and buy a fancy car. He didn't move to a mansion. He didn't even tell most of his friends about the money. Instead, he invested it in his music career, bought time to hone his craft, took on bolder projects, hired a small team to help him create soundtracks with purpose and heart. In many ways, Peter felt even more pressure now, not from his father, but from himself. If this was the extent of his safety net, then he'd better make it count. He had to earn his own story, not just live in the shadow of someone else's legacy. Over the years, people would continue to ask him about his last name, about the money, about what it felt like to be the son of one of the richest men in the world. And Peter would always return to the same answer, not rehearsed, but felt. My dad didn't raise us with money. He raised us with values. It wasn't the stock that shaped him. It was the silence before it. The years he spent building without ever knowing there was a safety net beneath him. And that, he realized, was the real gift. After the quiet shock of realizing who his father truly was in the eyes of the world, Peter found himself standing at a quiet crossroads. The magnitude of Warren Buffett's wealth had been revealed, but what came next was entirely his choice. And that choice was clear. Peter wasn't drawn to boardrooms or balance sheets. He didn't long to sit beside his father at shareholder meetings or analyze the future of global markets. While others might have been eager to step into a multi-billion-dollar shadow, Peter turned toward something else entirely. A keyboard, a studio, and a sound that had always been his. Music wasn't just a hobby to him, it was a calling. Warren never pressured him otherwise. There were no lectures about joining Berkshire Hathaway, no guilt trips or expectations wrapped in dollar signs. Instead, his father repeated what he had always said, "Do what you love." And Peter did. While his peers may have chased startups or MBAs, he scored small films, composed for television, and eventually landed a significant opportunity. Composing for Dances with Wolves, a film that would go on to win multiple Academy Awards. It was a breakthrough moment, not because of fame or money, but because it validated everything he had worked for. He had made it, on his own terms. He wasn't Warren Buffett's son who dabbled in music. He was Peter Buffett, a serious composer, recognized for his craft. What surprised many wasn't just his talent, but the humility with which he carried it. There was no name-dropping, no leveraging of his last name for career shortcuts. In fact, most people in the industry had no idea whose son he was. That was intentional. Peter wanted to earn every gig, every check, every ounce of respect. And he did. Of course, he knew that if he ever truly failed, if things went terribly wrong, there was a net below him. But Warren had taught him something more powerful than safety, the value of not needing it. That lesson lingered every time Peter walked into a studio with a new idea, every time he turned down work that didn't align with his artistic vision. He wasn't chasing wealth. He wasn't avoiding it either. He was simply following the same compass his father had given him, one that didn't point to money, but to meaning. Years later, when Peter reflected on the path he took, he often said that working at Berkshire Hathaway just wasn't for him. And Warren? He didn't just accept that, he celebrated it. Because for all the billions he'd built, Warren Buffett knew something few tycoons ever grasp. Raising a child who finds their own purpose? That's the rarest kind of wealth. As Peter Buffett grew older, he began to understand something deeper than wealth, something his father had modeled every day of his life, not with words, but with actions. It wasn't just about having less, it was about needing less. Warren Buffett still lived in the same house he bought in 1958. He still drove himself to work. He still bought breakfast at McDonald's, and not the deluxe meal, just whatever matched the spare change in his cup holder. This wasn't an affectation. It wasn't a stunt. It was a principle. Money should serve a purpose, not become one. That philosophy seeped into Peter's bones. He didn't just carry it through his music career, he carried it into marriage, into fatherhood, and into a deeper, more purposeful pursuit: philanthropy. In 2006, Warren Buffett stunned the world when he made the largest charitable pledge in history, committing to give away more than 99% of his fortune. But long before that headline, the seeds of generosity had already been planted at home. When Warren and his late wife Susan gave each of their children $1 billion, not to spend, but to use, they weren't bestowing riches. They were handing over responsibility. And for Peter, that responsibility became the Novo Foundation. Co-founded with his wife Jennifer, the foundation was a reflection of everything Peter believed: that real power lies in compassion, not control; that systemic problems like violence, inequality, and poverty couldn't be fixed by money alone, but by empathy, partnership, and long-term commitment. While others might have used that billion-dollar endowment to stamp their name on buildings, Peter chose a quieter path. He and Jennifer focused on empowering girls and women around the world, on healing trauma, on reshaping broken systems, on listening, truly listening, to those who had been silenced for too long. He often said, philanthropy should not be about giving back. It should be about giving forward. That distinction mattered, because even with unimaginable resources at his fingertips, Peter remained grounded in the values that had shaped him as a child: humility, creativity, purpose. He knew he had access to a name that opened doors, but he also knew what it meant to build his own. And in that journey, from piano keys to foundation boardrooms, from quiet realization to global impact, he carried with him the greatest inheritance of all: not money, not fame, but enough. Enough to do anything, not enough to do nothing. It was years after the quiet realization, after the press had crowned his father the Oracle of Omaha, after the interviews and articles and financial columns had cemented Warren Buffett as a legend, that Peter found himself in a moment that captured the full arc of his journey. He was walking into a modest studio, a fresh track spinning in his head, thinking about how to pair a cello's ache with the soft rise of piano keys. Outside, the world still buzzed with Berkshire Hathaway stock prices, but inside these walls, none of that mattered. What mattered was the work. The same kind of focus his father brought to numbers and business, Peter brought to sound. He wasn't a reflection of Warren Buffett's empire. He was his own architect, of feeling, of movement, of purpose. And that, perhaps, was the greatest success story of them all. Because Peter had every opportunity to take the easy road, to be known for his name, to chase applause that wasn't truly earned. But he didn't. He turned down the security of his father's company. He declined offers to ride the coattails of legacy. He refused to be defined by what he inherited, and instead insisted on being known for what he built. And in the background, Warren never stopped watching, never stopped cheering, not with fanfare, but with quiet conviction. When asked once what he hoped his children would become, Warren had said, "I want them to be good people, who find what they love and pursue it with everything they have." And Peter did. He became a creator, a husband, a father, a philanthropist, a man who helped reshape the world not through wealth, but through will. Through the Novo Foundation, Peter and his wife Jennifer began to channel not just money, but meaning into some of the most overlooked corners of the world, supporting girls and women who had been forgotten or failed by society. His fortune became fuel for others, not fanfare for himself. He once said, "It's not about what you keep. It's about what you give away." And somewhere, in a quiet office in Omaha, Warren Buffett smiled. Not because Peter had become wealthy, or successful, or even generous, but because he had stayed true. True to the boy who played piano in the living room, true to the young man who never asked for more, true to the lesson written not in ledgers, but in life, that the greatest inheritance is freedom, and the wisest way to use it is to earn your own name. Peter Buffett did, and he never looked back.